Time to start. So hello, everybody. This is Jen Leone, Chief Sustainability Officer at HPD. I'm not on video for technical reasons today, but I wanted to welcome everybody to this second session of our presentation, Solar for Multifamily Affordable Housing. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to talk briefly. We'll do a recap about some of the stuff we discussed last week. I will reintroduce our friends at SolarOne, and then we're going to focus on the solar screening tool, the review process, and talk about a few takeaways and next steps on this. Next slide. And here we go. So as we talked about last week, Local Law 92 and 94 of 2019 was launched as part of the Climate Mobilization Act, and it required green roofs or solar for all new roofs or roofs with structural roof replacements. And I think everybody knows about that. But part of the law was that for HPD projects, the requirement can be waived for reasons of financial infeasibility, at least through 2024. With a letter from HPD. But it also required that we consider an alternative compliance pathway and produce a report at the end of this period. So the Solarware feasible mandate was our response to that. The Solarware feasible mandate operationalizes a financial feasibility assessment and helps us at HPD assess the feasibility. But also provides resources to enable more, and we hope better, solar projects where they make the most sense. The mandate is codified in the 2020 overlay of Enterprise Green, which requires the full solar feasibility analysis, which we'll talk about today, and a signed solar approval form prior to filing for Enterprise Green pre-build. Note that it is also required for lead waivers. And what does feasible mean? Projects with a 10-year or less payback are generally considered feasible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to our partners at nonprofit SolarOne, Noah Ginsberg and Annika Wester-Jones. They've been working with HPD for many years to bring solar to affordable housing. And we're really excited to have them co-present with us and embark on this Solarware feasible journey. Take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Jen. And hi, everyone. My name's Noah Ginsberg. I am the director of SolarOne's Here Comes Solar program. Here Comes Solar is an initiative of nonprofit SolarOne that started about 6 years ago with the goal of expanding access to solar in New York City, particularly in underserved segments of the market. One major market being affordable housing. Our program model is that we offer technical assistance every step of the way to make solar simple and affordable. Thanks to a 3-year contract funded by NYSERDA, we are able to provide technical assistance to HPD as well as to affordable housing providers and their development teams to support the Solarware feasible mandate and to integrate hopefully a lot of cost-effective solar into the city's affordable housing stock. So I'm going to give a very quick recap from the first session before Annika is going to take us through the solar screening tool itself. For those that weren't at the session last week, or just to recap, the major takeaways are that HPD Solarware Feasible is designed to be a win-win. HPD is requiring that every building gets screened for solar, but only really requiring that projects include solar when it is beneficial to the project, basically when the solar pays for itself. Another big takeaway is that the early bird catches the worm. The earlier that you start looking at solar and integrating it into your design, the better your solar design is going to be, and the more opportunities there are for cost savings and just elegant design from the beginning. Another consideration is that solar can be optimized. You can really maximize your savings by optimizing your solar design, but also looking at ways that you can maximize your solar incentives. So during our last session, we talked about safe harboring solar tax credits and different ways that you can treat the NYSERDA incentive to increase the basis for your solar tax credit. And of course, solar ready design will help lower your costs. Another takeaway is that when possible, you should look for co-benefits. So solar canopies, while they're not the lowest cost solar option, they are often the way to get the most solar capacity onto your roof, and they can provide a bunch of great co-benefits. Like if you are planning a tenant accessible space on the roof, it can provide a shade structure. If you have a lot of HVAC equipment on the roof, an elevated solar canopy could potentially help extend the life of that HVAC equipment. And the same actually for the roof itself. Maximizing solar production. Maximizing solar production can also help defray the cost of electrification. And then last but not least, we're going to say this early and often, solar technical assistance is available. So our team is available to assist you with looking at the best ways to integrate solar into your project and to provide procurement assistance if you'd like us to prepare and run an RFP on your behalf. The easiest way to get in touch with us is just to email affordable@solarone.org. And then another takeaway, which I think the rest of this next part of the session will make clear, is that the HPD solar screening tool was designed to be simple and user-friendly, really for non-solar professionals. So it's something that we encourage you not to shy away from and think that it's something that only your sustainability consultant can work with. It can really, anyone can work with it, and hopefully that'll become clear as we move through the presentation. Next slide. So this is just an overview of solar in the enterprise green communities process, basically where solar fits in. So you can see there's solar feasibility screening. The analysis takes place early on in the process. Selecting your solar contractor is something you're going to want to do before closing. Some projects will require final designs and permits for closing. Others might move forward with the design and permitting, final design and permitting following closing. We're going to talk a lot more. Jen is going to take us through the solar approval process. So there'll be plenty of time to answer any questions that come up about that. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Annika Wister-Jones, who will introduce the solar screening tool.
Great, thanks a lot, Noah. And so as many of you saw in our workshop last week, there are some things that make a building more favorable for solar, but how do you know if that is then going to be actually feasible? You find out through the solar screening tool. So we're going to go line by line through the solar screening tool so that you can feel confident filling it in on your own or talking about it with us as we fill it in. So this should look a little familiar, at least. We developed this in collaboration with HPD to make it as simple and user-friendly and accurate as possible. So let's start with the building characteristics. You first put in basic things like the address, the HPD ID, the building type, so rental or co-op or condo, whether it's new construction or renovation, if it requires prevailing wage or not. Not surprisingly, prevailing wage affects the price estimated. And then the completion year of the project, which will affect the price of the solar and tax credit rates, the solar price and the rates for the tax credits. And then there are some other things. I'm going to skip over the tax credits right now and talk about the building height, which, just to note, is the height of the plane of the roof rather than the tallest point. And then I want to note that whether it's in a landmark or historic district, and if it's in an income qualifying census tract, those are really only relevant. The income qualifying census tract is only really relevant if the building is owner occupied and also in a historic district. For new construction, fairly unusual that it would be in a historic district, but if it is, then that affects the costs as well. But if you don't know whether it's in an income qualifying census tract, unless it's in a historic district and it's owner occupied, you don't have to worry about finding it out. But if it is, then it could possibly mean that the building is eligible for an additional tax credit. So that's why we include it. And then I also want to note that the solar canopy design should be set to no unless you have a design ready that includes a solar canopy in it. For the tax credit eligibility, let's go through this one by one. So if the owner of the building has federal income tax liability, if they pay income taxes, or if it's a LIHTC deal, then you can mark yes for the eligible for solar tax credit. That's the federal investment tax credit for solar. If they're eligible for the solar tax credit, they're probably also eligible for accelerated depreciation, which at the federal level, they can take 100% of the depreciation in the first year. But I want to note that HPD doesn't take depreciation into account for underwriting. So if you're using this for the screening tool, you should mark it as no, but it's still true. So you can look at it both ways for looking at what the benefits are for the owner versus looking at it for HPD's underwriting. One of the useful things about the tool is that you can toggle settings on and off. If it's a LIHTC project, then you can choose no, 4% or 9%. So if it's LIHTC, choose 4% or 9%. And I want to note that for 9% deals, as many of you know, the eligible basis might not actually be available. But it's worth looking at this both ways and talking to your HPD PM, the whole team, because solar might be a better scope item than some other items that are covered because of the way that the solar tax credit and LIHTC interact. It might be helpful there, and also because solar saves money on operations and maintenance down the line. And then the last thing is that if the building is anticipated to pay some property taxes, if it's not completely abated, then you can mark yes for eligible for NYC solar property tax abatement. And if you want to look at the specific rules, because there's a couple tax abatements that are not compatible with the solar property tax abatement, there's a hyperlink here where you can click on that and see exactly what works and what doesn't work. Or you can always ask us at Solar One. For the electrical inputs, the owner paid electricity information, you want to put in the utility, which in New York City is almost always Con Edison, and then the estimated owner paid electricity costs. That is, you should put in as accurate a number as you can. But if you don't have a number already, then you can always use HDC's M&O cost estimate, which is $164 per room, or CPC's cost estimate. But keep in mind that if it's a building that's going through electrification, then it might be higher than that. And it's always better to try to estimate it as accurately as possible. That number is used to make sure that the solar design doesn't overproduce for the building, and that the tariff from the utility is accurate. So depending on the utility tariff, a building might receive different values of solar energy. So for example, a walk-up building is usually a small commercial utility tariff, which means that it would get about 22 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas an elevator building counts as large commercial more often than not. And so it gets 11 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can see that the value of solar is about half. For a master metered building or another building, a non-master metered building that is doing community solar for the tenant or the resident's benefit, then the rate is back up at 22 cents per kilowatt hour. So metering configuration can really impact the value of solar. And that's something that we can help you with if you're interested in doing some sort of shared solar for the residents of the building. Earlier, we noted, we kind of skipped over, I'm going to go back and show this, the estimated usable roof area for solar. And I want to give a more detailed account of how you can find this if you don't already have a solar design. If you have a solar design, by all means, use those calculations in the Advanced Inputs tab. But if you don't have anything except a roof plan, then this is how you can calculate it. According to local law 92 and 94, a sustainable roofing zone, which is the same thing as what we call usable roof area for solar. We just think that's a clearer way of describing it. It's any contiguous area on the roof that's greater than 200 square feet and not obstructed by things like mechanical equipment, rooftop structures, fire access pathways, recreational space, things like that. So if you take each one of those locations and add them up, then that's the number that you can put in the estimated usable roof area for solar. And then if you already have a solar design, then you can use the Advanced Inputs tab, which I'm going to go back again. You can get to the Advanced Inputs tab down here with this orange button. And then it'll pull up the Advanced Inputs tab, which you can use if you know the answers to some of these specific questions, like the exact system size or the solar energy system price, or precisely what the peak demand is for the building. If you put a number in here, it'll override the estimate for that number in the calculations, but it won't change any of the other assumptions. So you should only use the fields that you have good numbers for, and only fill in the fields that you need. So often when I'm using this, I'll only fill in the system size after doing a system design and leave everything else to the calculations of the tool. And then if you decide you didn't want to use these, you can always clear the advanced inputs and go back to the default assumptions. And then the last input page is the layout page, which actually doesn't need to be very much of an input page. You can include an image of your roof plan or the solar layout here. But if you have a full roof plan that you're submitting in addition to the screening tool and the solar approval form, then you don't need to try to fit it into the box here. But in the blue box down here, we'd like you to just write a quick summary of the design and what considerations you used. So for example, we included a raised canopy design to put solar over the HVAC systems, or there's a green roof on the north section, or we took into consideration the vents when we were calculating the usable roof area, things like that. So finally, once you have all of that information input, then you get the results tab. I want to note that if you don't have all of the information filled in, there'll be a little red note down here that says, warning, this screening tool isn't fully filled out. So make sure that you fill in all of the cells in the user inputs tab. The results page will show the system size, the yearly utility bill savings, which you can include as a negative cost in the O&M budget. It also includes an estimate of the upfront cost after the NYSERDA rebate, which reduces the upfront cost. And that's what you include in the project scope. And then it also includes the payback period, which if it's 10 years or less, then solar is deemed feasible and therefore required by the Solarware feasible mandate. If it's over 10 years, but still it provides good savings, and maybe it's 11, 13 years, then solar may still actually be a good option, and we would recommend it, but it's not required. So it's up to the developer, to the owner, to make that decision. And it also includes other information like internal rate of return and lifetime savings and the precise number for the tax credits for reference there. If you have any questions about how this tool works, we included a lot of information on the assumptions and calculations in the first tab, the instructions and assumptions tab. And so that includes information on how the costs were calculated, the tax incentives, the production estimate, things like that. If you have any specific questions, though, you can always email affordable@solar1.org and we can talk to you specifically. So we went through a lot of the solar screening tool there. Now is time for questions on the tool itself and how to use it. you can use the Q&A function for questions, or you can put things in the chat, but I think it's generally easier to use the Q&A section. Looks like one question we got from the chat is, what is the definition of unobstructed? Basically, if there's nothing already on the roof there. So if there is, for example, a water tower, located in the middle of the roof, then that area is obstructed. If there is a like condenser that's located on the roof, that area is obstructed. But other than that, any open area on the roof is unobstructed. Another question that we have is, do canopy solar systems each need to be greater than 200 square feet, or is there a smaller multiple canopies equaling greater than 200 square feet? Would that work? So the first thing to note is that 200 square feet is actually very small. It's 20 by 10. So you could have small multiple canopies, but you probably wouldn't actually design something that small. So that's the reason why that requirement is there. It's just that you probably wouldn't be able to create a system that's a reasonable size in less than 200 square feet. But remember that the requirements for local law 92 and 94, those are the requirements for the solar mandate. So if you would like to put solar in smaller areas, you're more than welcome to do that. And canopies are usually done in situations where you're putting more solar on than is required by the mandate. So you can put it wherever you want, provided zoning and structural things are taken into consideration. How do you deal with existing vents and fans? Do you always assume a canopy? No, I don't always assume a canopy. For existing vents and fans, you just work around them. You can cut out space for a vent that's sticking up from the roof. You just don't put a solar panel in that area. That's one of the things that the solar tool takes into account, is that it has a pretty low estimate for the system size based on the square footage, assuming that there will probably be a couple vents or something that would need to be worked around, so that the ultimate system size is fairly close to the estimate based on the square footage. What if the solar payback is under 10 years, but you want to opt for the green roof instead? That is an option for the solar approval form. And I think Jen can talk to that later, but yes, that is an option that you can take. Another question is it economically feasible to have multiple levels of solar roof areas if you have different roof levels? Yeah, definitely. As long as each roof level isn't very small. If you have 5 kilowatts on one roof and 2 kilowatts on another, it's probably not feasible then. But if overall you can get to a reasonable system size by using multiple roof levels, then that's perfectly fine. And so this was a follow-up on the question about the small areas for vents and fans, whether you calculate the space, do you or do you not take out those small areas? I would say for something small like a drain or a pipe vent, you don't need to take out the space for that. If it's something more larger, like a condenser on the roof, then I would take out the space for something larger like that. How often do we plan to update the installation cost on the tool, Noah?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So we're going to be updating the tool at least every 6 months. We're actually planning to release an updated version of the tool in the next week or two to reflect some positive new developments with solar and affordable housing tax incentives that went into effect at the end of December. And we're regularly looking at at the costs as well as the incentives and the electricity rates in the tool.
While you're here, Noah, do you want to answer any of the other outstanding questions? So it's not
Sure.
just me talking.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So another question that came in, do we deduct shading on the roof for the usable area? Yes, I think the best practice is not to put solar in an area that's directly shaded throughout the day and throughout the year. There's a little bit of gray area, honestly, because a little bit of shade can be, a solar energy system can tolerate a little bit of shade. So that's one thing to take into consideration. Another thing that I just want to flag is that using usable roof area as the input to drive your estimated solar energy system size is a really good first pass. However, because the solar screening tool does require a preliminary solar layout, we're actually superimposing a solar array on your rooftop, either in the solar layout tab of the tool or as a separate site plan. Ultimately, you will need to do an actual system layout, which again is not hugely labor intensive. It's something that Solar One can assist with free of charge. Your sustainability consultant could certainly assist with it as well. But so all that is to say, the getting an accurate square footage for usable roof area is it's a fairly rough cut. And then once you do an actual layout, our recommendation at that point, if you have a layout, would be to open up the Advanced Inputs tab and to put in the system size for the solar energy system that you designed for your project.
Yeah, that's a good point, Noah. I think it's important when you're thinking about shading or vents to think that the usable roof area is, plus or minus 10, 15% of the size of the system, depending on what actually shows up on the roof plan and how the solar is designed. So it's very good for determining more or less if solar is feasible, but certainly before you run procurement or make a final determination, you should get some sort of solar design.
So we have a couple other questions that have come in relating to shade. We appreciate the focus on this. Yes, it's important. We don't want to be encouraging solar in the shade. It is something that we take into account. Certainly when we're doing preliminary solar design ourselves, we'll create keep outs. We'll say we're not putting solar in areas that are shaded, in the middle of the day during peak production months. The software we use will kind of automatically clear out those areas. But then, I think there are other strategies. If you're really looking to maximize solar production to reduce your operating expenses or offset the cost of, electrification, something of that nature, that would be a great case for doing something like a canopy design. So if you have a roof where you have your bulkhead, let's say, is on the southern portion of the roof, you probably want to leave a lot of space behind that bulkhead before you start putting solar panels right on the roof surface, because you're going to get shade throughout the day and throughout the year. However, if you elevate your system up in the air, 9 feet, 10 feet up on a canopy, that's a great way to work around the shade. And then there are some sites that just are not viable for solar. I mean, if you're building a 6-story building and you're directly north of a 15-story building, frankly, we wouldn't recommend putting solar on that rooftop because you're going to be shaded for most of the year. And that's exactly the kind of project that would get a waiver. And you just want to reiterate this. The goal of this program is to look at projects and make a common sense determination. Is this a good candidate for solar? Is it technically feasible? Is it financially feasible? If the answer to both of those questions are yes, only then does HPD require it.
Noah, what you just said seems to have brought up another question, which is very thought-provoking. In the urban context, shading is something that can easily change if a tall building were built right next to you. Would you recommend looking into adjacent zoning plans?
The short answer is yes, to a degree. I think it's always important, and I'm sure that as you're looking at developing a multifamily affordable housing property, you're already looking at what else is going on in the surrounding area. So if you know, for example, that there is a plan to put up high-rise buildings due south of the property, that is something to take into account when looking at solar feasibility. I think some of these things are just hard to predict, hard to know. In theory, a high-rise building could get built to the south of your building, but frankly, the same is true. There are a lot of factors kind of outside of our control, and our recommendation is to think about it, to look at it, and then to make a good common sense decision.
And I think keeping in mind as you all know, the pace of development in New York City, often solar will pay for itself before something that hasn't yet begun to be planned could actually be constructed. So there still could be, even if the worst should happen and a much taller building is eventually built right next to and to the south of your building, it's still entirely possible that the building could already have benefited from solar and continue to receive enough savings for it to be worth it. So it's not entirely a lost cause if that happens.
Great, and then we're going to address this one last question that came in before we move on, and Jen's going to walk us through the actual solar approval process for HPD. So this last question that came in is, do we have to fill out the tool if the project will cover all usable roof area with green roofs or terraces? So the answer to that question is no. You would still need to submit a solar approval form. And in that solar approval form, you would simply need to indicate the reason that you're requesting a waiver from the solar requirement is that you're covering the development with the green roof, and that's something that HPD will be happy to see and approve.
I want to add one thing to that, Noah, which is that the roof plan is always required as part of the analysis so that we can see that. And we've noted 90% of roof area covered in green roof to align with the DOB. But clearly, if you have a roof made up of a bunch of teeny tiny terraces and a green roof, and a roof deck and so on, we'll be able to see that, pretty clearly. So you don't have to go completely crazy with the 90% exact requirement. So hopefully that helps with that question.
Great. Take it away, Jennifer. Sorry, Jen. You can go forward with the review process, since it seems like some of the questions have started to tend towards that topic.
Great. So thank you guys for that. That was really clear. So where does the solar feasibility analysis fit in with Enterprise Green? We're focusing on this primarily because most of our projects do go through that process rather than LEED. And just if you focus on the orange box here, we are requiring this as a prerequisite for the Enterprise Green pre-build authorization process. So that means anytime from when your project kicks off after the build's intake or your early design consultations, you could submit the solar feasibility analysis. Now, we know there's kind of a weird sweet spot in here where your project either has too little information or has so much information that it's impossible to make changes based on a good solar design. So we hope that by giving everybody the tools to think about solar, you can find the sweet spot in terms of the timing. What we've said on here is that we're recommending that you think backward a little bit from your Enterprise Green pre-build and submit this at least a month before you plan to submit for Enterprise Green. That gives you plenty of time for the review process and any kind of challenges and issues that come up. And Enterprise Green pre-build, we typically see and would like to see somewhere in, the 3 to 8 months before loan closing. And we will make every attempt to turn around these reviews within 2 weeks from the time that we receive a complete and accurate package. And this is really important thing to note. If we are going to get a solar feasibility that's missing information or has inaccuracies or items that don't, match from form to form, then we're going to have a lot of trouble getting that back in 2 weeks. That doesn't give us enough time to review and find inconsistencies and so on. So we're saying 2 weeks from the time of an accurate feasibility analysis. Next slide. So what does the feasibility analysis look like? So Annika talked about the roof plan and how that works. You would take your roof plan, and the roof plan will either give you enough information to generate a usable roof area, or, if you have a little bit more information, a usable roof area, discounting some areas on the roof that may have shadow or shade or so on. If you have a more precise design, you've already worked through this either yourself or with your consultant, you can put those more precise specifications into the inputs or the advanced input section of the tool. Can you click, please? Then the next thing you would do is, click on the summary tab, and you'll know pretty quickly if your assumptions are yielding a good feasible solar analysis. If you see that the payback is 10 years or less, and you're sure your inputs are correct, then the project meets our requirements and you can proceed with the rest of the analysis. If you click on this, and it's really important that you actually hit the summary tab, if something spits out that just looks wrong, there's a good chance that it is wrong. So once you take a look at that, you can see if are your inputs correct, go back to the input tab and make sure, did you include the right tax credit information, the right size? Did you forget to click canopy or whatever that might be? If the payback looks greater than 10 years and you really think that solar should be on the project, which we do, of course, you can use the tool to think about how you might modify the design for a better outcome. And if you're really baffled or need some help or technical assistance or want to just ask some questions, we recommend that you contact SolarOne. This is what they're there for. This is what the NYSERDA grant gives us, is this amazing resource. I think that we've talked about it before, but again, we can't state it enough that SolarOne is, they are experts in this, and they can provide a number of different kinds of assistance to our development teams and in fact to HPD staff as well. So they can help with the screening tool, but they can also help talk teams through the design, the incentives, optimizing a layout. These are all really critical in the solar feasibility analysis piece of our projects. And the other thing I would say is it's perfectly okay and recommended to contact SolarOne, before you submit your feasibility analysis. We definitely encourage that, because rather than try and kind of muddle your way through the process and hope everything's right and send your feasibility analysis to HPD for a fast turnaround, you can optimize your design and get this all figured out early so that when you do submit, it's much quicker for us. Next slide. So, whoops, this is really confusing because I can't see the screen. So the information from the screening tool will then be used to fill in the solar approval form. It's important to note that the information really does need to be filled in accurately. If you have any questions, talk to your HPD project manager. We need the kind of information that is on the tool. We need to know which program you're in. We need to know your HPD ID so we don't lose the form. And please try and use the correct project name. I know that's really challenging for our project. They sometimes have multiple names. And then once you have the feasibility analysis filled out using the exact information that's on the solar screening tool, and noting, of course, if you're seeking a waiver for any one of the reasons on the form, then you would make sure that you take all of this information and package it together with the solar screening tool and the roof plan before sending. A quick note, we want to make sure that every project, including those with multiple buildings, do the solar screening tool for each building. One thing you'll note on the tab or on the form is that we do not expect a screening tool for projects that are, pursuing the green roof option, nor do we expect you to run the tool for projects where it's clear that you cannot put a minimum 4 kilowatt system on the roof. If you have a very small building or a building with a very unusual or highly dense mechanical set of systems on the roof, where there's simply no room for the solar, we don't expect that exercise to be done. And we are working on a continuation form for this so that multi-building projects can use one approval for multiple buildings, and all the information will be sort of in one place. Can you click, please? It's really important to use the most up-to-date forms on HPD's website. I can't state this enough. We'll try to release new forms only when necessary, when there's something really important triggering an update. And as Noah mentioned, we will be putting out a new tool next week to reflect some of the new stimulus plan changes for the solar tax credit and so on. But it's also just good practice. Sometimes we make really minor changes that'll help you fill in the forms better. And we want to make sure that they're in there. Secondly, please ensure your application is complete and accurate. There's no way to guarantee a 2-week turnaround if we have to go back and forth a bunch of times trying to figure out where mistakes are and why forms don't match up. And as well, we mentioned, and Annika mentioned, give us some information about your project. If, for instance, your solar payback looks to be, say, 12 years, but it's part of a really important architectural feature, we want to know that can definitely factor into our review process. Next slide. So what is our review process? This is a little diagram. Excuse the sirens. For projects and submissions that are proposing solar, what are we looking for? We're going to look for accuracy of information, of course. We're going to want to make sure the incentives are correctly noted. Is this a 4% deal? If it's a 9% LIHTC project, it's very unlikely that the project will be able to take advantage of those tax credits. So if we see a great looking project with 9% tax credits noted, we'll probably ask about that because it's, again, those are really hard to, put on the projects. And then we'll look at the design and the cost of the system being proposed. Are they reasonable? Does the cost make sense? Is the design optimized? If we notice anything unusual on the roof, like something that would definitely cause a massive shadow on the proposed system, we would want to note that as well. After that, we will either approve the design or approve the waiver. Actually, that comes up a little bit later in the slide. We'd approve the design. We may approve it as noted. So you would get back the signed form and it would say approved as noted, and then there'll be a comment. You might want to consider, X, Y, or Z, but those are just recommendations, not requirements. Or finally, last option, we would say, please revise and resubmit this analysis. And in those cases, you are certainly welcome to consult with SolarOne to figure out either, what is the reason for the resubmittal or the revision that we're requesting, or just getting help trying to optimize the system. That might be in a case where we see that the solar looks great, but is too costly, or maybe doesn't seem to be optimizing the roof space very well. Click. If we see a submission that includes a waiver request, we'll generally go through the same process. We'll verify that the information is correct, and we'll look at the assumptions for the waiver. Some of them are really simple, like, we can't accommodate 4 kilowatt. Here's the roof plan. It's, clearly infeasible. Or we have a green roof on, 90-ish% of the project. That would be another reason. In some cases, the reason for the waiver request will be, the payback is greater than 10 years. This is not a feasible project. And in some cases, there may be a reason beyond that, like a question that was brought up before. We know that a building will be built due south of this next year, and this project will be in shadow. There's a space for that on the form. There's a little narrative section, so please fill that in. And again, the process will be very similar. We'll either approve the waiver, approve it as noted, which could be something as simple as, we approve this waiver request, but there are better options. Or we'll say, please revise and resubmit. Some piece of information is not correct. Ideally, the revise and resubmit in all cases leads to a new submission, including a feasible solar design. Next slide. Once the analysis has been approved, whether it's the waiver or the design, you'll receive a signed approval form, and the HPD PM will be copied as well. And I think that was pretty clear what that form might look like. There's a space for notes and so on. And then click, please. If the project needs a DOB waiver, and this could be true of a project that includes solar, but not solar that meets the DOB's more stringent conditions, we can generate a letter for the DOB as and when it's needed. Next slide. What happens after the approval? If solar is included, it gets designed into the project, or the design, is included in the project, and it gets underwritten into the project's M&O. We expect that we can underwrite, a great deal of the projected energy cost savings. This is a big deal. This is what makes the 10-year payback really work for HPD, in that it doesn't require a massive subsidy to include the project. And we've been working with lenders and HDC to institutionalize this. Next slide. What if the payback exceeds 10 years, right? The 10 years makes sense from a cost feasibility standpoint, but, and that was our threshold, but there are certain projects that, can you click please? There's certain projects that might still be a good idea, even without a 10-year payback. What do those projects look like? That could be a project that has minimal subsidy impact, a project with really good co-benefits, like a canopy over a recreational space, something with significant architectural value, maybe community solar. And this is something that if we think it's, there's a reasonable case to be made, we will recommend that the applicant speaks to their project team to decide and determine whether this installation makes sense. Next slide. And to help assess these projects, we worked with our own internal team to develop this underwriting tab, and it's another orange button that you can see on the tool. And this helps translate the 10-year payback into something meaningful for HPD. And you'll see if you look closely that what it does is note the subsidy impact, and it's, the full subsidy impact or the per dwelling unit subsidy impact. And that can really help, especially on these cusp projects that maybe have an 11, 12, 13 year payback. And that's how we can have that conversation. And if this does come up on a project, then feel free to set up a meeting with Solar One, myself and your team to figure out, why should this project be included on the project, and this will help smooth that conversation. Next slide. So a couple things. We know that not everything stays static on an HPD project or any project. There's a couple things that could happen prior to closing, like the project needs to be value engineered. If that's the case, you know, we don't want to see solar be the first thing to get value engineered out, because if you take out the solar, you also take out the savings. So Solar One's available to help, you know, make a meaningful redesign instead of taking the solar out of the project entirely. And we'll do everything we can to make that happen. And there could be a significant change to the roof, you know, in addition to mechanical equipment or something else. Again, we'll want to see a revised and resubmitted feasibility analysis, but are happy to help try and optimize a redesign where needed. Finally, if, you know, after closing, a contingency may be available on a project that doesn't have solar, and Solar One can help see if a cost-effective array could be procured. That's another service that they can provide. And if a project completes without solar, it might be possible for a PPA or a lease after the fact. Next slide. So that was a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions on the process? We have a few more slides to get through, but I know this is really important, and we'd like to do what we can to answer questions.
Jen, the first question in the Q&A is, to whom exactly should we submit the tool and form and roof plan? Through email to the HPD project manager?
So this is all outlined on our website. There are precise instructions for how to submit and who it goes to. Also on the it's on the enterprise green section of HPD's website. And that'll give you information. It goes to me and the project manager, but there's really specific instructions for that located there.
And the next question is, where does solar thermal hot water heating fit into this analysis? I can answer this. Noah, if you have anything else to add, you're welcome to. Solar thermal is something that was very popular a few years ago when solar photovoltaic, so the electricity generating solar, was still very expensive. At this point, photovoltaic solar has gotten so cheap that it's actually a better deal and a better use of roof space in almost all situations than solar thermal. So unless you have a very specific and very good reason to use solar thermal, then we usually recommend using the photovoltaics to reduce your electricity load. And you're welcome to pair solar photovoltaics with an electric heat pump hot water heater, which is often maybe the most effective way to heat your hot water with solar.
And just to add to that, I would say if your project does include a solar thermal system, that would also be a reasonable justification for a waiver from, you know, the solar electric requirement. This program is really designed around solar electric systems because, like Annika mentioned, that really is the most feasible. Looking at time, should we keep
Yeah, I see no open questions. So yeah, let's move on. Okay, so this is pretty quick, but I don't have time to go through this really step by step. But Noah just shared out a pre-populated screening tool. This screening tool is much more useful than just simply something that's required to submit to HPD. It's a really good design tool and a resource. And it can be used to kind of test different designs and optimize your design. Especially for those folks who are kind of new to solar and don't have a really good handle on what the impacts are from, say, LIHTC or solar canopy versus ballasted system. So if you look on here, and you can play around on your own time with the tool, we ran the same design. Excuse my really bad drawings. It's hard to do it in PowerPoint. But we ran the same building under 4 different conditions. One of them was a 6,000 square foot canopy. And you can see on here that with the solar tax credit, which is generally part of all projects, and a 4% LIHTC tax credit, that you get a really productive system with an 8-year payback. And in fact, looking at that HPD Underwriting Tab, you'll see that it's a negative subsidy project when the solar savings are being underwritten, and also has a pretty good impact on carbon emissions. if you ran that same design with no LIHTC, you can see that the payback jumps to 13 years and the subsidy goes from negative to positive and, you know, somewhat substantial. And that might be one of those cases where HPD says that's not a great design, we don't want to support it. Now that could be a little different if there were people dancing under it and it's a roof deck, that might justify some of the extra cost. And is certainly something we want to hear about. If it looks like that's not really the case, you could rerun the system as a ballasted system. I made an assumption on this that it's 50% of the size of the canopy. I think depending on the orientation of this, some of this would be in shadow, but you can ignore that for a minute. And you can see that a ballasted system would have a lower cost per watt. It's cheaper to install, as you know from the last week's session. But with the 4% tax credit, you still get a low payback, a 7-year payback, and pretty good energy cost savings. Also negative subsidy here. Ballasted system, even without the tax credit, is just still a good deal. You can see that that same system, because it's a pretty significant size, has a 10-year payback and is negative subsidy. So again, this was just playing around with the tool to see what kind of results you can get with the embedded options. You can go much crazier and use the advanced inputs tab as well to try to find the sweet spot. And I think it's pretty evident that the 4% LIHTC deals are the best way to get a really intense and creative system on a project. But, you know, a project without the 4% tax credit can still be a good sweet spot for a ballasted design. Next slide. So just to wrap this up, these notes just kind of recap what we talked about. The solar feasibility analysis has to include the solar approval form, a roof plan, and the screening tool for each building in the project that doesn't have a green roof or less than 4 kilowatt array possible. 2-week review process, so long as your application is tight. You need the signed solar approval form for enterprise green. Projects with a 10-year payback are feasible and will be required, but some projects with a greater payback may also be approved with permission. The screening tool is a really good tool, and SolarOne can provide free technical assistance throughout the process. Last slide is stay tuned for updates. We've noted that the solar screening tool will be updated very soon. This will reflect the extension of the 26% federal solar tax credit, which has been extended through 2022. It's going to reflect the change to the 4% LIHTC floor, which has been fixed, and some additional clarity based on some suggestions from from the people we've worked with and who've used the tool. The solar approval form will be updated as well, a couple things just to make it easier to use. And all of this information will be updated on our website on the Solarware Feasible page. And it will include also links to these trainings and other resources. So always check in there for the most recent tools and other resources. And remember, you can always contact me or SolarOne if you have any questions. Next slide, the information is all on here for where to find us. And thank you. I can stick around. I think the Zoom, I don't know if our Zoom.
Yeah, we'll stay around and answer any lingering questions.